Throughout 8,000 years of human civilization, there is only one structure on Earth that was claimed to be visible from space. Millions of people traveled thousands of kilometers to see it, shivering in the cold or sweating in the summer heat, taking photos and saying, "Here I am." That structure is the Great Wall of China, and in all likelihood, everything you've learned about that structure is incomplete. Some of it is wrong, and a part of it has been intentionally shaped. We were always told this. The Great Wall of China was built to stop the nomadic tribes in the north, a grand defensive move, an empire's instinct to protect its children, a wall erected by civilization against barbarism. We heard this in elementary school. We saw it in documentaries. We read it in guidebooks. It was repeated so often that it never even occurred to us to question it. But I want to ask you this. If a wall was truly built against external enemies, why were the lives of hundreds of thousands of people sacrificed to build it? Why in the most critical sections of the wall are there gates, passages, and openings that make no military sense? Why are some parts of the wall positioned more logically to stop someone trying to get out rather than an attack coming from the outside? And why during the same period were walls, barricades, and checkpoints built inside the empire as well? Welcome to the Another Life History channel. Before starting the story, don't forget to support the production of these videos by subscribing. If you write which city and at what time you are watching this, I would be very happy, because it is a beautiful thing for people from all over the world to come together under this video to sleep. Thank you. Let's continue. Was the purpose of building the Great Wall of China defense? Or was it something else? We are here to ask this very question, and the answer lies much deeper than the stones of the Great Wall. It lies in the mind of the one seeking power, in the darkness of an obsession with control, and in the shadow of one of the greatest, longest-lasting, and most effective propaganda projects in history. If you are ready, let's begin. Because this story is not the story of a wall. It is the story of a man. And that man is one of the most complex, ruthless, and paranoid figures history has ever seen. But he was also a genius, and perhaps just as broken. His name was Qin Zheng, but you know him by another name, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. And everything started with a fear he experienced in the days when he was just learning to walk. In 2059 BC, in a place within the borders of today's Hebei province, a child was born. His mother was a concubine. His father was Yeren, the crown prince of the Qin kingdom. It sounds like a humble beginning, but this child's life was shaped right in the middle of danger from day one, because his father was held hostage in the Zhao kingdom as a product of political tension between two states, and little Qin Zheng lived there with his mother, in enemy territory, knowing that something could happen to them at any moment. When tensions between Zhao and Qin escalated, the anger of the Zhao people turned toward this family. People on the street knew this child and his mother. They knew who they were, and from time to time that anger turned into concrete threats. Historians report that his mother protected him by hiding his identity, sometimes hiding him in the homes of acquaintances. Think about it. A child just a few years old. His name is a danger. His existence is a target, and the world around him wants to destroy him. They survived. Eventually, thanks to political developments, they were able to return to Qin. His father became king after a while, but he passed away shortly after, and Qin Zheng, at the age of 13, sat on the throne of one of the most powerful states in the world at that time. 13 years old. This age might seem symbolic to us, but think, a 13-year-old child watching the power plays inside the palace, seeing the scandals surrounding his mother, learning how palace intrigues work, understanding who is trustworthy and who looks loyal but is ready to betray. And on one side, there is a deep scar created by his childhood in Zhao. He knows what happens once you fall weak. He knows what awaits once you lose control. Historians agree, even today, that these early experiences directly shaped Qin Shi Huang's personality in later years. Paranoia, obsession with control, intolerance to criticism, obsession with permanence. All of these can be read as an extension of that childhood fragility. But now, to understand Qin Shi Huang, we have to understand the world he came from, because that world was not an ordinary mess. That world was one of the longest, most exhausting, most destructive civil war periods in human history, the Warring States period, lasting about 250 years, from 475 to 221 BC. Reading this in a history book today feels cold and academic. A period name, a parenthesis, but try to imagine this. For 250 years, continuous war, people speaking the same language, on the same land, killing each other. Not a year passes without one kingdom wiping another off the map. Not a decade passes without borders radically changing. A generation cannot grow up in peace. A village does not stay within the borders of the same state for centuries. There were 7 great states in this period: Qin, Chu, Yan, Han, Wei, Zhao, and Qi. And these 7 states tried every way to destroy each other. Alliances were formed and immediately broken. Noble families were slaughtered overnight. Cities were burned. Populations were enslaved. Children were left orphans. Agricultural fields turned into ruins. Trade routes closed. The numbers are mind-boggling. Think only of the Battle of Changping in 2060 BC. This is just one battle. The Qin army defeated the Zhao army. And then what did it do? It took about 400,000 Zhao soldiers prisoner. It calculated that it couldn't feed them, couldn't transport them, and that they would pose a danger if released. It decided it buried them all, alive. Long trenches were dug, people were filled into them, and they were covered up. Only a handful of young soldiers were released to spread the news. This is not a legend. This is a fact recorded in multiple historical sources, and this fact is extremely important for us to understand the spirit of the era, because Qin Shi Huang grew up in this world. This was normal. This was power. This was survival. Qin grew by swallowing its rivals one by one during this period. Why Qin? Why not the others? The answer to this question is largely related to the philosophy Qin adopted. Other states leaned on traditional Confucian values, on nobility, on an order based on moral virtue, on respect for hierarchy. These sound nice, but in a time of war, these values slowed the system down. Old noble families protected their power. Reforms couldn't be made. The army was organized not by merit, but by birth. Qin chose a different school. Legalism. Legalism should not be confused with the Western understanding of law. This was a much harsher, much more mechanical philosophy of governance. Its basic argument was this: human nature is unreliable. People behave in certain ways not because they are good, but because they fear punishment or expect a reward. Therefore, the state must accept this reality and build the system accordingly. Reward and punishment, clear, predictable, ruthless. And the architect of this philosophy was a thinker and statesman named Shang Yang. In the 4th century BC, Shang Yang redesigned Qin's reforms from top to bottom. He carried out land reforms, dismantled feudal clan structures, and established a central bureaucracy. He reorganized the army. It was no longer which family a soldier came from. That was decisive, but his success on the battlefield, you rose as much as the number of enemies you killed. This was a simple but revolutionary change. The Qin army soon turned into the most disciplined, most motivated, most dangerous war machine of its time. Shang Yang's end is quite thought-provoking. After the Qin king who supported him died, he was captured by his enemies. His punishment was the harshest sentence of the system he himself had established. He was torn apart by chariots, and his entire family was slaughtered. But the system he established continued to live. It even grew stronger. And it was this system, when it passed into the hands of young Yin Zheng, that changed the course of history. In 2030 BC, Yin Zheng, no longer a young ruler but a leader dreaming of empire, launched a systematic campaign of conquest. Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and finally Qi, one by one, each carefully planned, each executed with legalist logic. Within exactly 10 years, the Chinese lands, which had been fragmented for 2.5 centuries, were united under the roof of a single ruler for the first time, in 221 BC. And Yin Zheng chose a new title for himself. King was no longer enough. The concept of king was old. It belonged to the past. He was something different. Huangdi, emperor. And not just an ordinary emperor. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. His name in full translation meant the first sacred emperor of Qin. He predicted that those who came after him would be the 2nd, 3rd, 10th. He imagined his dynasty would last for thousands of years. He wanted immortality, literal immortality. But we will get to that. Now let's go back to the wall. When and why did Qin Shi Huang's decision to start the wall emerge? It is not possible to give a simple answer to this question, because this decision was not the product of a single threat. It was shaped at the intersection of multiple pressures coming from both outside and inside. The threat outside was real. The Singun, nomadic communities flowing down from the steppes of today's Mongolia. We usually read about these people as barbarians in history books, but this definition serves no purpose other than to belittle them. The Singun were a community with a highly sophisticated horse culture, extremely effective in war, creating a real headache for Chinese armies. They were fast, they were unpredictable, they hit and ran. If you chased them, you couldn't catch them. They didn't have a fixed city. If you made a deal, you never knew how long they would stick to it. And for Qin Shi Huang's legalist mindset, this situation was extremely disturbing. Something you cannot control is the biggest threat to your system, but the threat inside was perhaps deeper. Qin Shi Huang had established a new empire, but under this empire there were millions of people who had been independent states just a few years ago, with their own identities, their own traditions, their own historical memories. There were the people of Zhao, there were the people of Chu, people who did not forget their own defeats, their own losses, the killing of their own rulers. How will you manage them? How will you keep them together? Qin Shi Huang tried many ways. He created a standard writing system across the country. He standardized weights and measures. He built roads, thousands of kilometers. He unified the currency. All of these were policies aimed at integrating different cultures into a single system, and at the same time, they were control mechanisms. But something else was needed. Something bigger. Something that takes shape in people's minds. A common enemy. One of the oldest ways to keep an empire together is to divert the public's attention from internal problems to an external threat. And the Gun were cut out for this job. A real threat, a real source of discomfort. But the more you magnify it, the more the people feel in need of you, the more they say, "We need a strong ruler to protect us," and you become that ruler. It is at this point that the idea of the wall ceases to be a purely military project. It becomes a political tool, and even when we look deeper into Qin Shi Huang's mindset, it becomes the expression of an existential need. Head General Meng Tian was given the task, in this process, active roughly between 221 and 206 BC, small walls and barricades that previously existed along the northern border were combined, expanded, and rebuilt. These structures were mainly built using the Hang-Tu technique, that is, layer upon layer of rammed earth. This was not the magnificent stone structure we see today. It was a rougher, more temporary, more practical construction, but the scale was enormous. thousands of kilometers, steep mountains, deep valleys, rivers, deserts, a structure crossing all kinds of geography, and the labor required for this structure was gathered from every corner of the empire by force. 3 main methods were used for labor supply during the Qin period. The first was penal obligation. Did you commit a petty crime? Does your family owe taxes? The state sends you to the wall. The second was military obligation, meaning men conscripted during wartime and then directed to construction. The third was direct forced labor. Ordinary peasants, people torn from all over the country and driven to construction sites hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers away. I want to open a parenthesis here. Often, when telling this part of history, numbers come to the fore and people recede into the background. Hundreds of thousands of workers, millions of people. These numbers are so big that they don't become concrete. They remain abstract. But each one was a real person, someone with a family, a name, a field, someone thinking about what to eat in the morning, someone thinking about their children. And then one day state officials came to their village and took them away. Working conditions were inhumane. This is not an exaggeration. Archaeological findings and information filtered from period sources clearly support this. Food was scarce. Shelter was non-existent or extremely primitive. The climate was ruthless because the border regions of northern China are scorching in summer and freezing in winter. Disease outbreaks were inevitable. Medical facilities for the injured were almost zero, and the dead. Most of the time they were buried inside the wall. This wasn't just a logistical choice. There were neither vehicles nor time to transport corpses. As the wall grew, the number of dead inside it grew too. That's why when we hear that expression sometimes used for the Great Wall of China, the world's longest cemetery, if it gives us goosebumps, it's not just a dramatic phrase. It is literally a reflection of the truth. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in these constructions. Some academic assessments speak of much higher figures. It is impossible to give an exact number because the records of the Qin period are extremely incomplete, but the overall picture is clear, and this picture takes us back to our fundamental question. If this wall is really to protect against an external threat, why did so many people lose their lives? How logical is it to consume your own people on this scale to establish a military defense line? Does an emperor fear the nomads in the north, or does he worry about his own people inside? The answer to these questions will take us to a much darker place in the next section. We will go into Qin Shi Huang's control mechanisms, his understanding of propaganda, and the true meaning of the fact that the wall was not just a wall, because this emperor didn't just build a wall, he built a system, and within that system the Great Wall assumes an unexpected role. If you want to understand Qin Shi Huang, you first have to accept this. This man was not an ordinary tyrant. There are many tyrants in history, leaders who get drunk on power and torment the people, sacrifice everything to win a war, kill masses for their own interest have unfortunately existed in every period of history. But Qin Shi Huang does not quite fit into this category, because he wasn't just ruthless, he was also systematic, he was a visionary, and perhaps most importantly, he was someone who knew how to turn his fear into a philosophy. Does this make him less dangerous? No. On the contrary, it makes him much more dangerous, because the damage caused by a randomly killing tyrant remains within a certain limit. But a leader who turns his fear into a system, imposes that system on millions of people, and takes the authority of the past, the promise of the future, and divine legitimacy behind him, leaves a mark for generations. He weaves a layer of meaning over his actions, and that layer of meaning sometimes lives much longer than the structure itself. Qin Shi Huang did exactly that. And the Great Wall was both a product and a tool of this process. But to understand this dimension of the wall, We first need to understand how the emperor's mind worked, because that mind was not an ordinary ruler's mindset. It harbored many layers that contradicted each other, fed each other, and tried to destroy each other. On one side was reason, a sharp, strategic, long-term thinking mind. He created institutions to manage unified China. He set standards. He built roads, canals, communication networks. These were real and functional tools that served to keep the country together. On the other side was paranoia, a deep-rooted, growing paranoia. He was subjected to assassination attempts more than once. He survived each time, but each time the insecurity inside him grew a little more. Over time, his sleep pattern was disrupted. He started sleeping in different rooms at night so no one would know where he was. He didn't trust anyone, even inside the palace. And on one side was the fear of death, perhaps the deepest of all. Qin Shi Huang was afraid of death. This looks like a simple observation, but its scale was extraordinary. For a person who had reached the pinnacle of power, death meant the end of everything. It meant his empire, the laws he set, the structures he built would lose their meaning, and this was unacceptable to him. He went on a quest for immortality. Literally, he summoned various alchemists and shamans to his palace. They promised him the elixir of immortality. He wanted to believe people who said legendary plants grew on mystical islands, legendary islets beyond the seas. Even according to some historians, this quest paradoxically killed him. It is thought that some immortality elixirs he consumed contained mercury, and mercury poisoning is suggested to explain his inconsistent behavior in later years and his early death. But the fear of death was not limited to physical death. He was also afraid of being forgotten, of being erased, of his actions leaving no trace behind. And this is where the link between the wall and this paranoia becomes clear. The Great Wall was partly an expression of permanence. "Look," said this wall, "I was here. I drew the border of this land. I built the empire and cast its borders in stone. These stones will stand after me, and everyone who looks will see my name, my power, my will." It's easy to belittle this motivation. We can say hubris and move on. But if we look deeper, there is an extremely extreme form of a universal human need here. The need to leave meaning. The desire "I was here and it mattered," felt by every person who passes away. In Qin Shi Huang, this desire turned into colossal projects dragging millions of people. But let's go back to political reality, because the wall was not just a reflection of the emperor's psychology, it was also an extremely calculated political move. Managing unified China was much harder than conquering it. Conquest was bloody but relatively simple. You either win or you lose. But ruling is something else. Because ruling meant keeping people with different memories, different identities, different loyalty structures together. The lands Qin conquered had lived as separate kingdoms for centuries. The Zhao people carried the Zhao identity. The Chu people, the Chu tradition. There were differences even in these people's languages. Their writing systems diverged, and in the memory of most, there were fathers killed by Qin armies, destroyed cities, burned histories. How do you manage them? Qin Shi Huang tried several ways. The standardization policy was the most important of these. A single writing system, a single currency, a single weight and measure standard. These sound like bureaucratic regulations, but they actually carried a much deeper meaning. Connecting different cultures to the same language, the same symbols, the same economic system was the most effective way to create a common identity over time. But Qin Shi Huang knew this wasn't enough. Because identity change is a slow process. It takes generations, and he couldn't wait generations, both because of concerns about his own health and the fragility of the empire. He wanted fast results. Two things were needed for this. First, big projects to occupy the people. and give them a sense of common purpose. Second, the concretization of the external threat. And the Great Wall met both of these. The function of big projects to occupy the public has been used by many empires throughout history. This is not a conspiracy theory, but one of the basic observations of political science. When people participate in a common construction, a common goal, it becomes harder for them to see each other as enemies. The idea we are building something together overrides the idea we actually come from different nations and were enemies of each other. Of course, this function was an extremely bloody experience for the workers building the wall. From their perspective, it was not participating in a common goal, but being forcibly driven. But from Qin Shi Huang's perspective, the suffering of these people was seen as a cost, not an obstacle. Legalism said exactly this. Anyway, individuals can be sacrificed for the interest of the state. This is the law. This is the system. And no emotional calculation is made for the system to work. Now let's come to the discourse of the external threat of the wall. The Zhishangum were a real problem. The reason I repeat this is, some narratives tend to belittle the Zhishangum threat or reduce it entirely to political implications. But this is not true. Zhishangum cavalry were literally dangerous for the infantry-heavy structure of Qin armies. They were raiding border villages. They were taking animals, grain, people. This was not an abstraction, but a concrete daily danger. But the issue is this. The fact that the threat is real doesn't mean the way it's used is legitimate. Qin Shi Huang both took the Shogun threat seriously with its real dimension and glorified it as a political tool. These do not exclude each other. A threat can be real and at the same time be turned into propaganda material. There are countless examples of this in history, and the wall was the physical embodiment of this discourse. Look, the wall said, there is danger from the north. I am protecting you from that danger. This wall is here for you. When the people received this message, they felt their dependence on the emperor, the savior, the protector, the one with power, and this feeling laid the foundation for an authority legitimacy that would last for centuries. But let's ask a very critical question here. Were the Shogun really stopped? Short answer, no. Long answer is much more interesting. The wall built in the Qin period did not fully stop Shogun raids. It couldn't, because the Shogun's strategy was not to attack a fixed front. They moved fast. They found the wall's weak points. They used gates, passes, unprotected sections, and from time to time they completely bypassed the wall. We understand this from Qin documents themselves. The northern expeditions under the command of Meng Tian failed to permanently repel the Shogun. It distanced them, put them under pressure, caused them to retreat in certain periods, but it didn't destroy them, because destroying nomads on the battlefield was an almost impossible goal for settled armies. They didn't disappear. They retreated into the depths of the steppes. They vanished from sight. Then they returned. This fact was a fact known to the Qin administration, and yet the wall was built. Why? Because the function of the wall was to define the border rather than stop the Exranongun. A physical, visible, indisputable border. This is the empire's land. Beyond is not. The military value of this definition was limited, but its symbolic value was enormous. And here we reach the second major dimension of the wall's real function, keeping inside. This subject is almost never mentioned in the general discourse about the Great Wall of China, because the discourse always focuses on the threat coming from outside. But archaeological findings and historical documents indicate that the wall controlled not only the enemy outside but also the people inside. How? Towers and checkpoints placed along the wall served against its own people as well as the Shogun. Chinese peasants and small communities living near the northern border had to obtain a permit to cross the wall. These documents were part of the legalist bureaucracy. Who is going where? Why are they going? When are they returning? Records of all of this were kept. This was a control system, and that control system was a reflection of Qin's understanding of internal security. Qin Shi Huang feared his own people as much as he feared the external enemy, maybe more, because the external enemy was predictable, definable. If the Xiongnu were attacking, they usually did so in certain seasons through certain routes. But a rebellion inside, an assassination attempt, a conspiracy, these were unpredictable. Indeed, unpredictable things happened. Assassination attempts occurred. Conspiracies were formed inside the palace. And after Qin Shi Huang died, the empire he built collapsed at incredible speed. Within only 15 years, his son's reign didn't even last 4 years. But this collapse allows us to better understand how tight the control he established while he was alive was, because that system was so tied to his personal authority that it couldn't stand without him, and the wall was the biggest, most visible part of this personal authority system. Now, let's look at the psychological effect of the wall's construction on the public. This dimension is included enough in very few narratives, but in my opinion, it is one of the most important dimensions. Qin Shi Huang gave the famous order to burn books in 2113 BC. He found philosophies outside legalism, especially Confucianism, dangerous, and to eliminate this danger, he had hundreds of years of historical texts, poems, and philosophical works burned. The scale of this event is controversial. Some sources say some works were saved, but the general picture was clear. The past would be erased. Only Qin's past would remain. A year later, in 212 BC, about 460 Confucian scholars thought to have expressed critical views were buried alive. Some historians find this event exaggerated. Some accept it as fact. But what matters is not the number, but the message. Criticism was forbidden. Thinking differently was dangerous. Clinging to the past was a death risk. In this atmosphere, what meaning did the wall carry? For people, that is, for ordinary Chinese folk. The wall was first a symbol of fear. Being sent there meant perhaps not being able to return. For those whose relatives went there, that wall was the symbol of uncertainty and pain. Remember the legend of Mengjiang. That story was the expression of this collective trauma. But over time, and this is very important, the wall turned into something else, into a symbol of the empire's power, greatness, permanence. That is, a source of pride of sorts. How did this transformation happen? Through propaganda. Qin Shi Huang's palace was a great narrative-producing machine. Texts written by the emperor's order glorified the structures he built. His campaigns were epicized. His achievements were exaggerated, and these narratives spread throughout the lands he controlled. The protection against barbarians discourse of the wall was also part of this narrative. People were given this message. There was danger from the north. The emperor protected you. This wall is his debt to you. Be grateful to him. For people who heard this message, their relatives who died while building the wall could be framed as a sacrifice given for the empire, not as a disaster. And this framing loaded the pain with a meaning instead of rendering it meaningless, a heavy, painful but specific meaning. Throughout history, strong governments have used this mechanism repeatedly. Qin Shi Huang was one of the names who did this, perhaps for the first time in history on this scale, and in this conscious manner. Now let's take a step back and look at the whole picture. Qin Shi Huang died in 2110 BC. His death was hidden. The palace put crates of fish in the carriage to mask the smell. His son Shi, who replaced him, was weak and incompetent. He drowned in the midst of palace intrigues. In 26 BC, the Qin dynasty collapsed. The Han dynasty took its place. The Han dynasty abandoned many of Qin's practices. Legalism gave way to a softer Confucianism, but some things remained. The central governance structure remained. Standardized writing and measures remained, and the wall system on the northern border remained, and it remained by getting stronger, because the Xuyongun threat hadn't ended. The Han dynasty also had to deal with this threat, and repeatedly that wall system was expanded, repaired, rebuilt. But in the Han period, the function of the wall gained a dimension different from the Qin period. Han emperors both fought with the Xiongnu and established diplomatic relations within the framework of a system called Hekqin. Han princesses were sent as brides to Xiongnu leaders. Silk, grain, and other valuable goods were gifted, so the wall served not just as a defensive line, but also as a negotiation border. This far is my empire. If you accept this border, we trade, we agree. If you don't accept, we stop here. This picture further complicates the simple defensive wall narrative about what the wall is, because the same structure was used for different purposes in different periods, for defense, for border definition, for internal control, for propaganda, as a diplomatic boundary line, and ultimately as a symbol. This flexibility also explains why the wall was so permanent. Different empires were able to load meaning onto the same structure for different needs, and every meaning loaded extended the life of the structure. But the biggest reconstruction process came not from the Qin period, but from a much later period. It was not Qin Shi Huang who built the majority of the Great Wall of China we see today. Those who built that monumental stone structure, those magnificent towers, those wide platforms tourists walk on, were the engineers and workers of the Ming dynasty. And the story of the Ming period was no less complex than the Qin period. But before moving to Ming, we need to look at the centuries in between, the Mongol issue, and the question of whether the wall really worked, because that question has a much more striking answer than you think. The answer is partly yes, partly no, and the no part contains one of the biggest wall stories in history. You build a wall, for decades, centuries, thousands of people die, millions of people labor, and then the enemy enters through the flat gate. In the next section we will look at exactly this, the story of the Mongols, how Genghis Khan looked at that wall, and why the Ming dynasty decided to rebuild that wall centuries later, this time much bigger and much more expensive, because Ming's decision to rebuild the wall was shaped by fear no less than Qin's, perhaps more. And this time the fear was coming from a different direction. What did Genghis Khan think when he first looked at the Great Wall of China? We don't know the answer to this question for sure, but what we know is this. He didn't jump over it to cross that wall. He went around it, and while doing so, he seized control of the lands the wall defended. Perhaps the most expensive defense system in history was almost disregarded by the founder of the world's largest land empire. This moment raises the most striking question about the true function of the Great Wall. If this wall is really a defense structure, why didn't it work? Why did one of the most destructive invasions in history happen despite this wall? And why do we almost never ask this question? But before getting there, it is necessary to look at that long interval stretching from Qin to the Mongol period, because in that interval, the fate of the Great Wall followed quite an interesting course. In some periods it was strengthened, in some periods neglected, in some periods it was a political tool, in some periods a defense line, but in no period was it a truly impassable obstacle. The Han dynasty both rejected and carried Qin's legacy. It rejected it because it had to soften the harshness of legalism. The Qin period's ruthless tax system, forced labor practices, and intolerance to criticism had paved the way for public rebellion. Han saw this and adopted a more flexible understanding of governance, but it carried it because the central state structure and the northern border issue remained valid for Han as well. The Han emperor's relationship with the Xiongnu proceeded like an extremely complicated pendulum. For a period they fought, they suffered great losses. Then they sat at the negotiation table with the Hekqin system, that is, sending princesses and gifts. They secured temporary peaces. Then they fought again. This pendulum was also reflected in the function of the wall. In times of war, the wall was repaired, strengthened, troops were deployed. In times of peace, it was neglected. This pattern is important because it tells us this. The wall was not always seen as the primary line of defense. It served as a bargaining chip from time to time, as a border marker from time to time, and as a purely political symbol from time to time. In Han's brightest period, during the time of Emperor Wu, major campaigns conducted against the Xiongnu went beyond the wall. That is, they switched from defense to offense. This was both a strategic change and a psychological message. We are no longer just defending, we are attacking. In this period, the wall remained in the background. Because the defensive understanding had lost its validity, the offensive understanding had come to the fore. But the Han dynasty also eventually collapsed. In 2020 AD, periods of fragmentation and civil war lasting for centuries began. The Three Kingdoms period came, then the Six Dynasties period. In these chaotic centuries, the control of northern China changed hands repeatedly, and the wall was largely abandoned amidst this chaos. It wasn't repaired, it wasn't protected, it was left to the ravages of time and climate. Then came the Sui dynasty, a short but intense dynasty, and it did something interesting. It rebuilt the wall, and with great energy, hundreds of thousands of workers were mobilized again. Some historians suggest that construction works in the Sui period were more intense than in the Qin period, and these construction works, the heavy burden on the people, became one of the factors accelerating the collapse of the Sui dynasty. Just like in Qin, this repetition is noteworthy. Both Qin and Sui were shaken by public rebellion due to giant construction projects and collapsed. This is not a coincidence. Large-scale forced labor produces a structure in the short term, but in the long term it erodes the social structure. It consumes people's trust in the system, and once this trust is exhausted, the empire loses the ground to stand on. After Sui came the Tang dynasty. Tang represents one of the brightest periods of Chinese history. Culture, art, trade, diplomacy. The Silk Road lived its most active period during Tang times. And interestingly, during the Tang period, the wall largely receded into the background. Why? Because Tang's northern policy was different. A complex but generally functional relationship was established with Turkic tribes, especially the Gökturks. Trade was conducted, alliances were formed, battles were fought from time to time, but the general picture was a border relationship manageable enough not to need the wall. In the Tang period, the wall lost its political importance. Physically, it also decayed. It fell into ruin, and this points to an important point. The wall was meaningful only when there was a political will behind it. If that will didn't exist, stones could go no further than being stones. Then came the Song dynasty, and with Song, perhaps one of the most painful periods in Chinese history began. The pressure coming from the north increased with every passing decade. Khitans, Jurchens, and finally Mongols. Song lost the northern lands. It had to move its capital to the south. And the wall was already in the northern lands. That is, it was no longer under China's control. It was beyond the enemy line. It had remained completely dysfunctional as a defense structure, and it was at this point that Genghis Khan took the stage. The vast majority of what is told about the Mongols depicts them as one-dimensional destroyers. This is an incomplete picture. The truth is much more layered. Genghis Khan, yes, created tremendous destruction, but at the same time he established an administrative system unprecedented in history. He managed different cultures, religions, languages. He protected long-distance trade. He developed legal systems. But what interests us right now is his approach to China. When Genghis Khan and the Mongols came face to face with the Great Wall of China, they looked at that wall and saw a basic strategic truth. A wall is only as strong as those defending it. Who are the defenders of the wall? Soldiers. And why are those soldiers fighting? For money? For duty? Because they are under pressure. If you can buy them, trick them, or leave them unable to fight, the wall consists merely of stone. Genghis Khan and his successors found the way to enter China, not in the wall, but in politics. They bribed, they betrayed, they formed alliances. From time to time, by agreeing with local rulers in northern China, they had the gates opened, and along the wall, the Mongol army advanced through passages obtained via negotiation. In 1211, Genghis Khan entered the lands of the Jin dynasty in northern China. He breached the wall, and largely, instead of breaking the resistance of the defenders by systematically neutralizing them, his grandchildren followed the same path. When Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, he had taken China entirely under Mongol rule. This was one of the largest and most comprehensive military operations the world had seen until that day. And the Great Wall of China did not stop this operation. It couldn't, because the wall's basic military assumption was wrong. That assumption was this: the enemy will try to pass by breaking the front. But the Mongols didn't break the front. They went around the front, with political manipulation, strategic patience, and unseen mobility. This fact reveals the weakest point of the great legend about the Great Wall of China. The defensive wall narrative assumes that the enemy will behave in a certain way, but the enemy does not always behave as expected, and enemies who are truly dangerous never behave as expected. Mongol rule lasted about a century. The Yuan dynasty collapsed in 1368, and the name who toppled it lived one of the most striking rise stories in history. Zhu Yuanzhang, beggar, monk, rebel, and finally emperor, the founder of the Ming dynasty, and the Ming dynasty created the version of the Great Wall of China we see today. Zhu Yuanzhang, that is, Emperor Hongwu, had to rebuild China, which he took over from Mongol rule. This was not solely a physical reconstruction, it was a cultural, political, and psychological reconstruction, because Mongol rule had deeply shaken the Chinese identity. How does a people who remained under the rule of a foreign dynasty for 100 years feel? This question is the key to our understanding of all Ming policies. The answer is that people feel both fragile and angry. Fragile because they bowed once, angry because they don't want to accept that submission, and the political result emerging from this mixture is this: never again. Ming's never again policy showed itself in every field. Sea trade was restricted, then banned. Relations with the outside world were narrowed. Introversion began, and the northern border issue triggered the biggest construction project history has ever seen. Because the Mongols hadn't gone, they had withdrawn, but they were watching from the steppes, and Ming's rulers knew they could return. This fear was both real and exaggerated. It was real because the Mongol threat hadn't completely disappeared. It was exaggerated because that magnificent military power of the Yuan period had largely dispersed following Ming's collapse. The Mongol tribes in the north were no longer a unified force. But fear does not always reflect reality one-to-one. Fear exaggerates, it magnifies, and this magnified fear directed Ming to a massive construction. The wall built in the Ming period was very different from the structures of the Qin and Han periods, both technologically and in scale. It was no longer rammed earth but granite and brick, thick, sturdy, detailed. Wide platforms that could be walked on, watchtowers placed at regular intervals, communication systems for logistical support. This structure is the structure tourists see today, that magnificent wall we see in photos, posters, image archives today. Not the one Qin Shi Huang had built, the one Ming's emperors had built. And the Ming period wall was built with an important difference from the Qin period. Technology had advanced, organization had developed, but the labor supply issue hadn't changed at its core. Forced labor continued, military units were directed to construction, and the civilian population, especially those living in border regions, bore a heavy burden. The period when Ming period construction was most intense was a process of about 100 years, extending from the end of the 15th century to the end of the 16th century. During this time, large sections extending from north of Beijing to the west, from Shanhaiguan to Jiayuguan, were built or radically renovated. Shanhaiguan, that magnificent pass by the sea, starting as if emerging from the water. Jiayuguan, that tower standing like the end of the world at the edge of the Gobi Desert. The distance between these 2 points is about 2,000 kilometers, and a significant part of this distance was built in the Ming period. The cost of this construction was enormous, not only in terms of money and labor, but also politically. The Ming treasury poured massive resources into this project, and these resources could have been used elsewhere to develop trade networks, to strengthen the navy, to support agriculture. But Ming's priorities were different. Security was ahead of everything, and security had to take a concrete, visible physical form. Here we return to the political function of the wall. Ming's building of the wall was not solely a military decision, it was also a legitimacy strategy. Think Ming came to power by expelling the Mongols, and to maintain its power, it had to constantly remind its people, "We protected you, we expelled the Mongols, and we are building this wall so they don't enter these lands again." This narrative legitimized the existence of the Ming dynasty. The wall was not merely a structure but also a political promise. "We will protect you. Here is the proof." And the people adopted this narrative because the trauma created by Mongol rule was real. That period was coded in people's memory as being crushed under a foreign power, and now their own dynasty was doing something concrete to ensure that period was not experienced again. The most effective form of propaganda emerges when it overlaps with something people already feel. Ming's wall narrative was exactly this. People were already afraid. People already wanted protection. And when the emperor told them, "Look, this wall is for you," this wasn't merely a lie. It was an exaggerated, shaped version of the truth framed for political purposes. But exactly at this point we encounter one of the most bitter ironies of history. The Ming dynasty came to the brink of internal collapse, starting from the end of the 16th century, palace intrigue, corruption, weak emperors, economic pressure, and a new threat coming from the north. The Manchus. The Manchus were a Tungusic community, coming from today's Manchuria region, and they gradually grew stronger. They organized, they saw Ming's weakness and seized the opportunity. In 1644, an internal turmoil broke out in Beijing. A rebel named Li Zecheng entered the city. The emperor hanged himself, and Ming effectively ended. So how did the Manchus enter this chaos? Through the door. Literally, through the door. Ming General Wu Sangui, who controlled the Shanhaiguan Pass, made a deal with the Manchus. He opened the gate, Manchu armies entered, and that wall which had been built, strengthened, repaired for 150 years on which massive resources were spent, was rendered dysfunctional as a result of a political decision. This moment gives the clearest lesson about the defensive function of the Great Wall of China. Walls stop people, but they don't stop people's decisions. If a gatekeeper decides to open the gate, the world's strongest wall carries no meaning, and this fact was confirmed repeatedly for the Great Wall of China. Genghis Khan passed through political manipulation, the Manchus passed through betrayal, and in both cases the wall could not go beyond remaining merely a physical obstacle. The Manchus established the Qing dynasty, and in the Qing period a quite interesting attitude was adopted towards the Great Wall of China. Qing did not repair that wall, did not strengthen it, because Qing, as a dynasty coming from the northern steppes, was inside the wall now. For them this wall was not a defensive line, but a relic of a past era. But more importantly, Qing's northern policy was completely different. Kinship relations were established with Mongol tribes. Buddhist ties were reinforced through religion. The control of the steppes was ensured not with a wall, but with political and cultural integration. This approach is extremely instructive because it tells us this: the most effective way to manage the threat coming from the north was not a wall, it was diplomacy, trade, cultural connection and smart politics, and Qing achieved this. For 250 years the northern border remained relatively stable, without a wall. This fact largely reveals the result of the debate about the defensive function of the Great Wall of China. The wall served a certain deterrent function under certain conditions against certain types of threats. It prevented small-scale raids, created a logistical barrier, worked as a signaling and early warning system. But it didn't stop a large, organized, strategically thinking enemy. It couldn't, because big threats do not jump over walls. They go around walls, dig tunnels under them, or by the gatekeepers. And knowing this fact, when we look at the Great Wall of China again, we have to ask our question again. So what was this wall really for? We have already seen part of the answer. Border definition, propaganda, desire for permanence, occupying the public, internal control, legitimacy strategy. But there is one more dimension, perhaps the least spoken dimension, and this dimension is directly linked to how the wall is perceived today. That dimension is this: the Great Wall of China, from the moment it was built, functioned more as what it was believed to be than what it really was. That is, as a legend, and this legend became much stronger and much more permanent than the stone itself. In the next section we will look at how this legend was shaped, how the West discovered the wall, and the propaganda layers in the modern period. Because the claim visible from space and the story of the Great Wall of China transforming into a world icon is no less interesting than the physical construction of the wall. On the contrary, it is perhaps even more interesting, because building a structure is hard, but building a legend around that structure is the work that requires real mastery. It is hard to say exactly when a legend begins. Legends are not born in a day. They are not declared by a decree. They accumulate slowly. A writer says something. Another writer takes it and magnifies it a bit. A traveler tells what they saw. Listeners add their own imaginations to that narrative. Generations pass. Each passing generation adds a new layer to the story. And finally, the thing that emerges no longer carries a direct link to reality. It turns into a narrative that lives on its own, operating according to its own rules. The Great Wall of China legend was shaped exactly like this, and the most striking example of this legend is perhaps one of the most common geographical misconceptions in history. The claim, the Great Wall of China can be seen from space. Is there anyone who hasn't heard this? Most likely not. This claim has been repeated so often, so many times that it now feels like a fact. It entered school textbooks, it entered guidebooks, it was said in documentaries, it was told to tourists, and people have this thought in the back of their minds while looking at that wall. This structure is seen from space. How big, how strong, how permanent. There is just one problem. This claim is not true. The Great Wall of China cannot be seen from space, at least not with the naked eye, unaided. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei personally announced this after returning from his space journey in 2003. "I couldn't see it," he said. "I tried to look for it but couldn't see it." NASA made similar statements. The width of the wall varies between about 5 to 8 meters. This is far below the width the human eye can distinguish from that distance. To make a comparison, for a human hair to be visible from space, it would need to reach about 1,000 times its current width. So where did this claim come from? It appears for the first time in 1932 in the popular American publication Ripley's Believe It or Not, as a statement like, "the only man-made structure on Earth visible from space." The person who wrote this never verified it. They probably said it to create a dramatic effect. But this sentence stuck because people wanted to hear it, and this says a lot about the psychology of the legend. Why did people adopt this claim so easily? Because they already wanted to believe that the Great Wall of China was a big and important thing. The sentence "visible from space" confirmed this belief, and when confirmed, it wasn't questioned. This mechanism applies not only to the Great Wall of China. People easily adopt and do not question information that supports their existing beliefs. We call this cognitive bias, and the Great Wall of China legend is a perfect example of this bias. But how was this bias formed? Meaning, how did people reach this strong, this unshakable belief about the Great Wall of China? The answer to this starts by looking at how the West discovered the Great Wall of China. Europeans received initial information about the Great Wall of China, largely in the 16th and 17th centuries, thanks to the accounts of Jesuit missionaries and travelers. These accounts were shaped within an Orientalist framework, that is, within a narrative about the East that was fascinating, exotic, exaggerated. China was a distant, mysterious, inaccessible place for Europeans, and in that mysterious place there was a wall thousands of kilometers long. This was enough to fire the imagination. Travelers saw the wall or told about it without seeing it. They wrote, they drew, and every description was a bit more dramatic than the previous one. In the 17th century, English philosopher Francis Bacon mentioned the wall while talking about China's great achievements. In the 18th century, Voltaire used the wall as an indicator of civilization while glorifying China. In the 19th century, the wall became one of the favorite images of Western Romanticism. Human will, perseverance, the resistance of civilization against savagery. This framing was extremely powerful, because the Western narrative interpreted the wall in a way compatible with the West's own values. Instead of understanding China directly, it placed the wall into its own categories, and these categories were much more attractive than reality. So what was there in reality? In reality, there was a giant structure. Yes, but behind that structure, there were forcibly worked people. There were internal control mechanisms, there were propaganda tools, and it was a system that failed to stop the Mongol invasion, opened the door to Manchu entry, and was neglected and collapsed in various periods. The Western narrative did not see these, or did not want to see, because the narrative of the greatest defense structure in human history was much more beautiful and much more sellable. And this narrative also overlapped with the discourse within China itself, because Chinese rulers also in different periods presented the wall in similar ways. Symbol of power, representative of civilization, wall erected against the barbarian threat. This narrative was functional for both internal legitimacy and external prestige, so two different sides for two different reasons fed the same legend, and the legend grew. As it grew, it got ahead of the truth. Now, at this point, we need to come to the modern period, because the legend of the Great Wall of China gained a completely new dimension in the 20th century, and this dimension is both the most striking and the least questioned one. At the beginning of the 20th century, China was in a deep crisis. The Qing dynasty had collapsed. The Republic was established, but stability hadn't come. Civil war, Japanese occupation, poverty, fragmentation. And within this chaos, the Chinese identity was undergoing a serious shock. In 1949, the People's Republic was established. Mao Zedong said, "The Chinese people have stood up, and the new state had to shape both its internal and external discourse. Who are we? Where do we come from? What do we represent?" The Great Wall of China assumed a critical role in this process. Mao Zedong has a famous saying, "He who has not climbed the Great Wall is not a true Chinese." This sentence is still used as a tourist slogan today, but taken out of context, because Mao actually used this sentence within the framework of revolutionary motivation. It carried a meaning like revolution is a hard climb. He who manages that climb is a true Chinese. But words, when taken out of context, live their own lives. And this sentence over time combined with the idea that visiting the Great Wall of China is a national duty. The wall became the physical symbol of Chinese identity, and this identity was functional for both the nationalist discourse inside and the international image outside. In the early period of the People's Republic, the wall went through a significant restoration process. Especially the Badaling section, close to Beijing, was renovated to be opened to tourism. And in 1957, Badaling was opened to visitors. This date is not coincidental. Right in the middle of the Cold War era, China wanted to say something to both domestic and foreign public opinion. Look, we are the heirs of a great civilization. We have a history of thousands of years, and this history is carved in stone. The wall became the strongest proof of this discourse, and that strong proof was pumped to both the domestic public and the outside world. It entered the education curriculum, it entered cultural events, it entered diplomatic narratives, it entered visitor images. Think of Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972. This visit was one of the most dramatic diplomatic moves of the Cold War era. The American president, in a country that had not been recognized for decades and was seen as an enemy. And where did the most iconic moment of this visit take place? At the Great Wall of China. Nixon walked on the wall, said he was impressed, said this is truly a great wall. And this scene was reflected in the world media. Millions of people saw it. And this image symbolized both China's return to the world stage and the process of the wall becoming a global icon. How does a structure change with a president's visit? It doesn't change, of course, but the layer of meaning around that structure changes. Nixon's visit legitimized the wall in the eyes of Western public opinion. The message "our president went and was impressed" made the wall real and important for millions of Americans. And then tourism exploded. Starting from the 1980s, China opened its doors more and more to foreign tourists, and the Great Wall of China turned into the country's biggest tourism asset in this process. Badaling received millions of visitors every year. Other sections opened too: Mutianyu, Simatai, Jinshanling. Each a different experience, a different visual, a different photo opportunity. Tourism income reached enormous dimensions, and this economic reality further increased state investments towards preserving the wall. Not a vicious circle, on the contrary, a mutually feeding process. The wall brings tourism, tourism brings investment, investment strengthens the wall, the strengthened wall attracts more tourists. But in this process, the real history of the wall remained increasingly in the background. What do tourists see? A magnificent wall, a beautiful view, stones smelling of history, but they don't see the story of the people buried inside those stones. They don't see the political calculations behind that wall. They don't see the invasions that happened despite that wall. Tourism, by its nature, prefers magical narratives, not complex, contradictory, disturbing truths. And the Great Wall of China is a perfect tourism product in this context, because that magical narrative is already ready. The world's largest defense structure, the only human creation visible from space, the symbol of civilization rising with the labor of millions of people. Every word in this narrative is chosen, every emphasis calculated, and the visitor, when they enter this narrative, focuses on experiencing instead of questioning. So how does the Chinese state use the wall today? This question has a much more complex answer than you think. On one hand, the wall is one of the most important tools of China's soft power, an image presenting China in the international arena as both the heir of civilization and the subject of history. We are a history of thousands of years. We are not temporary. We always existed on these lands, and we will always exist. This message is sent to both China's neighbors and Western powers, and it is extremely effective because history is one of the strongest tools for producing legitimacy. On the other hand, in internal discourse, the wall intertwines with nationalist feelings. For Chinese citizens, the wall is concrete proof of their ancestors' greatness, a heritage that stood tall despite difficulties, continued for generations, and still stands there today. This feeling is cut out for reinforcing nationalist identity, but it is exactly here that the distance between historical truth and political discourse becomes most distinct. Because the emperors who built the wall invested in this wall not because they loved the Chinese people, but because they wanted to control them. Qin Shi Huang was a ruler who instrumentalized the people, not one who protected them. Ming emperors continued this project with fear and legitimacy concerns, and both forcibly worked millions of people for construction. Saying this truth doesn't find much response in the current political discourse, because that discourse prefers to present the wall as a monument of victory. But real history is much more contradictory. Still, one must say this too. The wall is truly a heritage today, not just the heritage of those who built it, but the heritage of the workers who died there, the heritage of the irony created by invaders who surpassed it, and the heritage of the legend formed around it, that is, of how the human mind can deceive itself. And there is another very important dimension that needs to come to the agenda right now. The physical condition of the wall. That is what happened to that legendary wall today. One of the great ironies of history is this. The Great Wall of China was destroyed not by war and invasion, but largely by neglect, weather conditions, tourism, and development pressure. Studies conducted by non-governmental organizations and researchers in China revealed extremely striking findings. A significant part of the wall, that is, according to some estimates more than 30%, is in ruins or completely destroyed. Long sections remaining outside the officially protected sections have been neglected for centuries. There are several reasons for this. First, peasants dismantled the stones of the wall for centuries and used them to build their own houses. This can be criticized, but it is understandable. Stone was valuable. Dismantling a part of the wall meant building a new house wall. The state couldn't prevent this or didn't want to prevent it. Second, development pressure in the 20th century either divides or completely eliminates some parts of the wall. Roads were opened, villages grew, agricultural areas expanded, and in these processes, some parts of the wall disappeared. Third, and perhaps the most ironic, overt tourism. Protected sections erode under the burden of millions of visitors. Stones wear out over time with unlimited human traffic. This situation has become a serious source of concern in recent years. China increased protection measures. Some sections were closed to visitors. Restoration works were accelerated. But these works themselves are also controversial, because it is suggested that some restoration projects rebuild the historical structure almost from scratch instead of preserving it. That is, some restored sections have actually lost their historical authenticity, and this situation adds a new layer of meaning. Some sections of the wall that millions of tourists visit today are actually not a structure of thousands of years, but a copy rebuilt decades ago. Real history is inside the invisible, just like this metaphor. The visible face of the Great Wall of China is big, magnificent, impressive, but the real story is under that surface, in the buried people, in political calculations, in defense strategies that didn't work, in how the legend swallowed the truth. In the next section, we will bring all these layers together. We will evaluate the question of whether the Great Wall of China was a tool of defense or control, with all the findings we have. And then we will come to perhaps the most important question. Does knowing all this make the Great Wall of China less great? Or does it reveal what truly makes it great? The answer is much more surprising than you think. If you want to understand what a wall means, you first have to ask this: who built it? Who was it built for? And who paid the price for it? These three questions upset a large part of what we know about the Great Wall of China, because the answers diverge sharply from each other. The builders were emperors. Those for whom it was said to be built were the people, and those who paid the price were neither the emperor nor the people in the abstract sense. Those who paid the price were ordinary people whose names did not pass into history, whose bones mixed into the wall, who could never return to their families. Without seeing this distinction clearly, it is impossible to grasp the true meaning of the wall. So far we have seen these. We saw the control obsession fed by Qin Shi Huang's early childhood trauma. We saw what kind of governance philosophy, legalism was. We saw how effective the wall was against the shogun. That is, we saw that it remained largely insufficient. We saw why the Ming dynasty built the wall we see today. We saw how the legend grew, how the West shaped this legend, and how modern China uses it. Now it's time to put the pieces of the puzzle together, but one must be careful while doing this, because saying the Great Wall of China was a fraud is just as wrong as saying the Great Wall of China was merely a defense structure. The truth always stands not in the middle of two extremes, but in a much more complex place. So let's ask this question properly first. Defense or control? To answer this question, we need to distinguish between the two. Defense is the act of resisting a physical threat coming from outside. Control is the need to manage, organize, and make predictable both the outside and the inside. These are not opposites, they can overlap, but even where they overlap, which one is prioritized is decisive. What was the priority for Qin Shi Huang? When we look at all historical evidence, the answer is control. First of all, control. The strongest proof of this emerges when looking at the entirety of projects carried out in the Qin period. The wall was not a standalone project. In the same period, thousands of kilometers of roads were built. Canals were opened. A standard writing system was adopted. Currency was unified, and large-scale population movements occurred. That is, people were settled in places the state deemed necessary. All of these are a controller's tools. Tools to manage an empire, to keep every part of it under the same central will. The wall was a part of this toolkit, an important part, but it was not a purely military project existing on its own. And when we look at the physical design of the wall, this reading is confirmed. Towers built along the wall were not solely for war purposes. Yes, they were used to observe enemy movements, but at the same time, they were part of a communication network extending to the extremities of the empire. The communication system worked with smoke signals, with flames. This system monitored the movements of its own people as much as it reported the movements of the shogun in the north. Who is passing? Where are they passing? When are they passing? This was a surveillance infrastructure, and surveillance serves control before defense. But one must say this too. Control is not necessarily a bad thing. A certain control mechanism is essential to manage an empire covering millions of people. Chaos, weak management, fragmentation, this kills people too. Maybe slower, but just as real. Qin Shi Huang's system was cruel. But we don't know if the Warring States period would have continued for centuries without that system, without a unified China. perhaps more blood would have been shed. This is a historical question with no definite answer, but even asking the question shows how multidimensional the subject is. Now, let's look at the issue of whether the wall really worked in a more systematic way. When evaluated in terms of military effectiveness, the Great Wall of China reveals a complex picture. In some periods, it served as an effective barrier against small-scale raids. Small Xiongnu groups, raiding forces of a few hundred or a few thousand people, were slowed down or deterred by the wall. This is not insignificant. For people living in border villages, this deterrence was a matter of life and death. But when a large organized strategic attack was in question, the wall repeatedly fell short. We saw this with concrete examples. Mongols passed, Manchus passed, and each time political weaknesses or betrayal were decisive rather than the physical breaching of the wall. This tells us something important. The wall was meaningful only when it was part of a strong political and military system. On its own, as a pile of stone and earth, it was not impassable. What made it meaningful was the manpower behind it, the logistical system, the political will, and if that will was absent or weakened, the wall remained only as decor. This fact makes the wall part of a much wider lesson about human history. Physical obstacles cannot compensate for political weaknesses. Walls cannot change people's decisions, and security stems from relationships, legitimacy, and social integrity, not from stone and mortar. Qin Shi Huang didn't want to or couldn't understand this. For him, security was something physical and visible. Control was something cast in stone. And this understanding both created the wall and eventually contributed to the collapse of his own empire. Because if he had devoted some of the resources he invested in stone to establishing a healthier relationship with the public, perhaps the Qin dynasty wouldn't have collapsed so quickly. The Ming dynasty repeated a similar mistake. Massive resources were transferred to the wall, but the internal structure rotted, corruption escalated, the people were crushed under heavy taxes, and when the Manchus had the gate opened, the length or thickness of the wall changed nothing. So what does all this tell us? It tells us this. The Great Wall of China was a good political tool rather than a good defense structure. But this tool worked like a double-edged knife. On one side, it gave a message to the outside. We are strong, our borders are clear, don't enter here. On the other side, it gave a message to the inside. I am the emperor, I control everywhere, submit. And this second message was sometimes much more important than the first. The issue of controlling the public constantly remains in the background in the analysis of the wall. But when we look carefully, we see this dimension in every period. In the Qin period, the wall was a tool for regulating internal population movements, an obstacle for those wanting to escape, a control point for those wanting to move without state approval. The system tracked its own citizens as well as the Xiongnu. In the Han period, the wall became a tool for regulating trade, taxation, goods control, the record of who went where. That is, it served as a customs gate. In the Ming period, the wall became a concrete indication of military discipline. Soldiers deployed along the border monitored both the threat from outside and kept the local population under control. Villages near the wall lived under this dual supervision, and in all these periods there is a common theme. The wall was a physical tool bringing the ruled people together with the ruler's will, not a border, but a system. And within this system, human bodies functioned as both construction material and objects of governance. This picture is disturbing. It needs to be, because a history that is not disturbing is not real history. Now I want to come to the biggest irony in the modern period. What does the Great Wall of China mean today? Physically, it is largely Ming period remains and the product of restorations in the last century, a unified but inconsistent structure that has piled multiple layers of history on top of each other. Some parts are 2,000 years old. Some parts are 50 years old. Symbolically, it is a phenomenon in itself now, an integral part of Chinese identity, a place people from all over the world visit as a pilgrimage, and this symbolic power has nothing to do with the reality of history. Tourists go up to Bedtime. They take photos. They stand in front of the view, walk on the wall, look into the distance, and what they feel is real. The weight of history is real. The magnitude of the structure is real. The feeling of admiration is real. But the story to which admiration is directed is largely fictionalized. That magnificent wall they see is the product of forced labor. Fathers, sons, husbands, brothers died there. The structure presented as protection against barbarians in the legend was also a tool for controlling its own people. And despite this structure, the greatest invasions of history occurred. Should knowing this destroy admiration? No, but it should transform it. Because real admiration is admiration for the truth, not the illusion. And the truth of the Great Wall of China is much deeper and much more impressive than the pink-painted legend. Think for over 2,000 years, different emperors, different dynasties, with different motivations put stone upon stone along that border. Each had their own fear, each had their own calculation, and those fears and calculations added up over time and turned into that colossal structure. This is one of the longest-running construction stories of humanity. One generation started, another continued. For thousands of years, thousands of different hands touched those stones. There is no other human work on this scale, in this continuity. And inside that structure, there is not just stone, but a power struggle lasting for generations. Struggle between emperors and people. Struggle between center and periphery. Struggle between settled civilization and nomadic freedom. Struggle between the desire for control and the desire for freedom. These struggles are not unique to China. They exist in every period, every geography of history. But the Great Wall of China is the version of these struggles cast in stone, the world's biggest political manifesto. And that manifesto shows both power and the limitation of power at the same time. It shows power, because if an emperor can mobilize tens of thousands of people and have a structure built over thousands of kilometers, crossing difficult geographies, this is an enormous organizational capacity. It shows the limitation of power, because that enormous structure couldn't stop a determined and smart enemy, couldn't eliminate fear, couldn't make the empire permanent, and finally couldn't prevent the rebellion of the people crushed under the weight of the system it built. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of the Great Wall of China. Power does not draw its own borders. Power turns into something else when it exceeds its limits, and that something else usually carries the seed of destruction. Qin Shi Huang wanted to control everything, and his empire collapsed in 15 years. The Ming dynasty wanted to bury security in stone, and its own general opened the gate. Both made the same mistake. They put physical force ahead of political legitimacy, and this lesson is not valid just for ancient China. How many great walls have we seen in history? How many administrations took their own people under control by saying the threat came from outside? How much propaganda consolidated its power by exaggerating a real threat? And how many empires collapse from within while trying to control the inside, not the outside? These questions take the Great Wall of China out of being just a history subject. It makes it a universal lesson of human nature and power dynamics. And within this universal lesson, there is also an individual story. The story of people whose names are unknown. Those millions of people who built the wall are not in history books, because history is usually the story of the powerful, of emperors, generals, dynasties, but the hands that placed every stone of that wall were the hands of the powerless, those forcibly driven, those who committed crimes, those who couldn't pay their tax, those born in the wrong place. The vast majority of these people chose nothing freely. They couldn't choose where they would be born. They couldn't choose under which emperor's rule they would live. And they couldn't choose whether to go to that construction site. But they placed those stones, and those stones still stand there. This fact does not justify the injustice those people experienced, but it shows how permanent their labor is. Thousands of years later, a structure shaped by the hands of people whose names are unknown continues to be one of the most iconic symbols of the world. And knowing this changes the look at that wall. At least it should change it. A tourist going up to Badaling or Mutianyu, while looking at the magnificent view, actually sees two things at the same time. First, the embodied state of imperial power and paranoia. Second, the permanence of the labor given, albeit forcibly by millions of people whose names are unknown. These two things seem to contradict each other, but actually they complement each other, because human history progresses with the constant togetherness of these two things, the will of the strong and the labor of the weak. And at the point where these two things intersect, from time to time humanity's most permanent works are born. Now, before coming to the last section, I want to internalize what we have seen so far for a moment, because in the last section we will bring all these layers together and ask that question which radically changes our view of the Great Wall of China. Is the wall really great? If it is great, for what is it great? And the answer to these questions will say things about both history and today. Because the story of the Great Wall of China isn't over, that wall still stands there. Narratives around it are still being shaped, and the question of who controls those narratives, how they control them, remains valid today. I want to tell you a scene. The year 2003, Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei is orbiting the Earth inside the Shenzhou 5 capsule. He went to space as the first Chinese person, a historic moment, and below, billions of people wonder what he will see. Especially one thing. They all know because they all read, heard, learned. The only man-made work visible from space, the Great Wall of China. Yang Liwei looks out the window, searches, doesn't find it. When he lands, he says honestly, "I didn't see it. I tried to look for it, but couldn't see it." This statement created a small shockwave in China. School textbooks had to be revised. A truth taught for years collapsed with the honesty of an astronaut. And this collapse looks very small but is actually extremely symbolic, because many things about the Great Wall of China work exactly like this. It is said again and again, it is adopted without questioning, and then when someone tells the truth, it reveals how fragile that truth is. But this section is not just about the collapse of a legend. This section is about bringing together everything we learned and asking this question, what is the Great Wall of China really? And more importantly, what does knowing this tell us? First, let's clarify the picture we have. The Great Wall of China is not a single structure, not the product of a single period, has not served a single purpose. It is a system of structures that different dynasties built, repaired and enlarged, and abandoned from time to time in different periods with different motivations. Within this system there are Qin's rammed earth walls, Han's extensions, Sui's reconstructions, and Ming's magnificent stone structure we see today. Does this mosaic make the wall less great? No. But does it make it more complex? Definitely yes. And this complexity is the source of its real greatness. When we look at the Great Wall of China, we actually see one of the most fundamental tensions of human history, the tension between security and freedom, the tension between individual life and collective power, the tension between reality and narrative, and deepest of all, the tension between fear and control. Qin Shi Huang had fear. This was a real fear. Both a personal fear coming from his childhood and an objective anxiety about the fragility of his newly established empire. And that fear turned itself into a wall, physical, visible, tangible. Mingam emperors had fear, a fear saying never again, created by the trauma left by Mongol rule. And that fear also turned itself into a wall, bigger, stronger, more expensive. This cycle of fear was the real construction motor of the Great Wall of China, not military strategy. Fear, not defense calculation. Fear. And this fear produces the same fallacy every time. If you build the wall high enough, your fear will pass. It doesn't pass. It never passed. Because walls do not eliminate fear. They embody fear. They give a form, a shape, a concreteness to fear. And that embodied fear is both a show of strength and a confession of weakness at the same time. Think about this. You build a wall. What does this wall say? I am afraid of something outside, and I want to stop that thing. So the existence of the wall accepts the existence of the threat. If there is no threat, why is there a wall? But what is more interesting is this. The wall, independent of how big the threat really is, makes that threat permanent, because as long as the wall stands there, the other side continues to be a real and dangerous place. If the wall is demolished, maybe the other is not that dangerous, but as long as the wall stands, the distinction stands too. And this distinction in both Qin and Ming periods was extremely functional for rulers, because without distinction, without us and them, keeping the people together becomes much harder. A common enemy produces a common identity, and a common identity facilitates governance. This mechanism is universal, not unique to China, Qin Shi Huang, or Ming emperors. But the Great Wall of China is the world's largest physical expression of this mechanism turned to stone, continuing to exist for thousands of years, and that's why it is important. Now, looking back from this point, we can say this. The answer to the question of whether the Great Wall of China was a tool of defense or control is both yes and no. But the real answer is in a place beyond these two. The Great Wall of China was, above all, a show of power, and the show of power works both outwardly and inwardly. The outward message is this: we can build something this big. We are this organized. Think twice about attacking us. The inward message is this: I built something this big. I rule this empire. Think twice about opposing me. This dual show of power actually exists in every large-scale architectural project. Pyramids, Palace of Versailles, Kremlin, Pentagon, big structures do not exist only for their functions. At the same time, they produce power discourse. They say we are this powerful, but there is something distinguishing the Great Wall of China from other big structures, and that is this. The Great Wall of China never finished. Every dynasty took it over and continued it. For centuries, different hands, different motivations, but continued to build in the same direction. This continuity exists in no other structure in the world, and this continuity tells us this. The wall was not an individual emperor's project in the end. It turned into a reflex of a civilization. Strengthen the wall when the threat comes. Reinforce the border when weakness is felt. Turn to stone when uncertainty grows. This reflex is the reflection of a deep security anxiety ingrained in Chinese civilization, and this anxiety is extremely understandable. For thousands of years, pressures coming from the north from time to time were real. Invasions were real. Destruction was real. And these real experiences formed a collective memory. That memory made the wall something meaningful. But at the same time, this memory and this reflex brought along a trap, like reducing the solution always to an obstacle directed outwards, and this trap produced the same result repeatedly. Great wall, great collapse. Cunid built, collapsed in 15 years. Suid built, collapsed in a short time. Ming built and the Manchus entered through the door. This pattern is not a coincidence. Large-scale forced construction consumes resources. Depletion of resources breaks the resistance of the people. Breaking of the people's resistance weakens loyalty to the state, and this weakness produces a real vulnerability against any pressure coming from outside. So ironically, building the wall made the thing the wall tried to protect more fragile in the long run. This is one of the biggest ironies of history, and to see this irony, one needs to look not at the structure, but at the process behind the structure. Now let's come to today. Because this story does not belong solely to the past, the Great Wall of China is one of the biggest destinations of world tourism today. Millions of people visit every year, and this visit is managed extremely carefully. Which sections are open, what is told to visitors, how the wall is presented, all of these are the result of conscious choices. Official Chinese discourse presents the wall as a symbol of the greatness of Chinese civilization and the determination of its people. Things emphasized in this presentation: the magnitude of construction, depth of history, continuity of civilization, and the common heritage of the Chinese people. Those not emphasized are these: forced labor, those who lost their lives, defense strategy that didn't work, the dimension of controlling its own people, and major invasions that occurred despite the wall. Is this selective presentation a kind of propaganda? Yes, in a certain sense it is, but at the same time it is what every nationalist discourse does. You build an identity with what you pick and choose from history. You have to choose because you cannot carry the whole truth at the same time. And when you make a choice, inevitably you produce a narrative. The problem is the presentation of that narrative as an absolute truth. The problem is rendering alternative readings invisible. And the problem is not questioning the power structure fed by that narrative. But one must say this too: China is not alone in this regard. In every corner of the world, every nationalist discourse works with similar mechanisms. Selective reading of history is a universal political practice, and every country has its own Great Wall of China, its own grand narrative, its own chosen truth. This awareness is not a criticism specific to China or another country, a general observation about human nature and power dynamics. Power always wants to legitimize itself, and controlling history is one of the strongest ways to control the future. Qin Shi Huang burned books, killed historians. By erasing the past, he tried to ensure that he was the true starting point. This was an extreme example, but essentially what he did was to establish control over history. While rebuilding the wall, Ming emperors were also building the narrative around it. We expelled the Mongols, we protected you, and this wall is the proof of this. This narrative was a selective reading of history, but it was an extremely effective reading. And today, thousands of years later, that selective reading is still alive. Tourists go up to that wall and walk inside a chosen narrative. They feel greatness, they feel the weight of history, but mostly, they don't see what is inside that weight. This is not because they are bad people, not from bad intentions. Just the presented narrative is so strong, so visual, so impressive that asking what is behind it doesn't come to mind. It is exactly at this point that we come to the purpose of this video. We are not here to stop visiting the Great Wall of China or thinking about it. On the contrary, to see it with a much richer eye, because knowing the truth doesn't destroy admiration, it deepens admiration. When you go up to that wall, you no longer see just a magnificent view. You see the fear of Qin Shi Huang's childhood. You see how a child growing up in enemy lands in Zhao cast that power into stone when he reached power. You see the stones placed, albeit forcibly, by hundreds of thousands of people whose names are unknown. You see that Mongols passed despite that wall, Manchus had the gate opened. You see that the wall won in legends, not in real wars. And you see that this legend was shaped by people all over the world, for different reasons in line with their own interests. After seeing all this, the look at that wall changes. It becomes bigger, it becomes more real, and it becomes more human. Because in the end, what the Great Wall of China tells is this: when people are afraid, they do big things. These big things work from time to time they don't. But in any case, they leave a mark behind. And that mark is the record of both power and fragility. This is not something just about Qin Shi Huang or Ming emperors. This is something about us. Something about humanity as a whole. We are afraid too. We try to control that fear too. We build walls too from time to time. Not physical walls maybe, but walls in our minds. Walls in our discourses, walls in our relationships, and those walls, just like the Great Wall of China, claim to protect us from the outside, but from time to time, their main function is to keep the inside under control. Seeing this doesn't mean you have to tear down the wall, but knowing what the wall really is allows you to choose how to live with it. Qin Shi Huang couldn't make this choice. He buried his fear in his system, and his system thought for him. Instead of facing fear, he cast his fear into stone, and those stones didn't save the empire. But they are still standing thousands of years later. Perhaps the last thing to be said is this: the Great Wall of China could not protect the empire it was built in, but it immortalized the civilization it was built in. And these two are very different things. An empire is temporary. Every empire, sooner or later, leaves its place to another. Qin left, Han left, Tang left, Ming left, but that wall remained. Different climates, different dynasties, different world orders came and passed. The wall remained. And right now, from beyond a time of over 2,000 years, it still says something to us. What does it say? You know what it says now. It tells the fears of the period it was built in. It tells the labor of people whose names are unknown. It tells the fragility under the claim of great power. It tells how legend can surpass truth. And ultimately, it tells that history is never single-voiced. Is the Great Wall of China really great? Yes, but not because of what you think. Not because it is visible from space. Not because it stopped the Mongols. Not because it proved the greatness of an emperor. It is great because it has carried the fear, hope, labor, and death of millions of people for thousands of years. It is great because it presents the most fundamental tensions of human nature to us in a form turned to stone. And it is great because when we look at it, we realize that we are actually looking at ourselves. That wall is our mirror. And what we see inside the mirror is our own story, as much as the story of emperors. Look at that wall again. Knowing this, it will look much bigger,